I am currently sick and look terrible, but I still wanted to get this video out before the raid releases, so this time around, you guys don't have to stare at my face. The Lightblinded Vanguard is the 5th boss of the Voidspire raid in the World of Warcraft Midnight expansion, and it's a council fight. I'm Odie, and let's get to it. This encounter is similar to Soul Hunters in Manaforge Omega, as it's a 3-target council fight, except this time, we are fighting paladins instead of demon hunters. During this encounter, you'll be swapping back and forth between being able to hit 2 or 3 stacked targets, as each boss has an empowered ability that forces you to bring them far away from the other bosses. Therefore, 2-target cleave or spread AoE classes will be strong here. There are no adds, so mass AoE talents that aren't great at lower target counts won't be worth it. As with any council fight, the most important thing you can do is ignore as many mechanics as possible that don't require your attention. If you don't, you can easily get overwhelmed. Focus on the one thing at a time that matters. It will help a lot if you get an idea for the timings by checking my link in the description so you know what to pay attention to at what time. First off, do not lust on pull. Bellamy and Sen will cast Divine Shield, making them immune, and Lightblood will cast Avenging Wrath, buffing his damage done and taken whenever you lust. There are ways to get around this, which I'll cover in the strat section, so be sure to stick around. Each boss has an ability they use at 100 energy, which buffs all bosses within 40 yards that can be seen by this pulsing circle. Sen's circle will pacify you if you hit any target within the circle, so make sure to swap away from her. Bellamy's circle will reduce damage taken by all bosses, and Lightblood's will increase damage done by all bosses. One important note is that you can stand within these circles and have no negative effects. However, once the ability ends, the boss will drop a consecration the same size as the circle, so you will have to move eventually. It's easier to just never stand in the circle. Other than that, each boss does 1 or 2 mechanics that you need to be aware of. It will be important to look at the timings linked in the description down below, because in addition to mechanics covered here, other boss abilities just do large damage to the entire raid or a few people, and overlaps can easily kill. So make sure you plan out your defensives. Lightblood, the Ret Paladin, will cast Execution Sentence, which targets 2 people on Heroic and puts a group soak on them. Immediately after the soak, hammers spawn in a spiral pattern from the soak location that you must dodge. Bellamy is the Prot Paladin and therefore casts Divine Toll and Avenger's Shield. Divine Toll is a bullet hell mechanic that shoots shields out from the boss in all directions. If you get hit, you are silenced for a few seconds and take damage. Avenger's Shield targets a few people with spread circles that you simply need to get out of the raid. Sen is the Holy Paladin who casts Tyr's Wrath. This puts an absolutely massive heal absorb on the 3 closest players to her every 3 seconds for 20 seconds. More on this in the strategy section. Sen also has another mechanic that puts up a shield on the boss that you must break to interrupt her cast. If you don't, you take massive raid-wide damage and everyone gets disoriented, so this is priority number 1. She will always go into this shield plus long cast by mounting up and running 10 to 15 yards at a player, dealing damage to anyone in the path, then planting with her shield and starting her cast. Last but not least, as always for council type fights, if you kill one of the bosses early, the others will gain a stacking 5% damage buff every 2 seconds. So an even kill is preferred. However, you could theoretically kill one of the bosses early to skip a potential raid wipe mechanic and still have time to kill the other bosses. The most significant difference on Mythic is there will be a buff that moves between each boss 1 by 1, which makes their main ability also cast the main ability of one other boss. For example, Bellamy casts the Divine Toll Bullet Hell, but on Mythic, when she has this buff, a spirit will also cast Sen's Tyr's Wrath at the same time. This forces you to handle 2 major mechanics consistently throughout the fight, when in Heroic, these mechanics would not overlap. In addition, the buff also empowers the boss's non-main mechanic to do something extra. Lightblood casts a Divine Storm, which simply does AoE damage in melee, so it wasn't covered in the mechanics section. However, on Mythic, this is empowered to also spawn Tempests that converge on Lightblood's position and must be dodged. Bellamy's Avenger's Shield, when empowered, will target all players, so everyone must spread. Sen casts Searing Radiance, which does AoE damage on Heroic. On Mythic, the empowered version increases its damage by 10% every 1 second, so it will be extremely important to watch your health and other mechanic overlaps toward the end of the Radiance channel. On top of all the empowered abilities, Execution Sentence now targets 4 players instead of 2, and Tyr's Wrath now puts heal absorbs on 5 players instead of 3. And if you thought Mythic didn't add enough, the consecration left behind after each boss casts their buff circle now also increases players' damage taken by 100% and pacifies them if you stand in it. So you absolutely do not want this dropped on the raid or to ever step foot into it by accident. There's quite a few tips for positioning and handling these mechanics, so I recommend you stick around until the end of the strategy section. Here are the timings for the fight on latest testing, and as always, you can find the link to the spreadsheet in the description down below. I I highly recommend familiarizing yourself with potential dangerous overlaps for good places to use defensives, as you can easily get two-shot. If you like the content, follow me on Twitch where I'm streaming most days of the week now that the expansion is live, and feel free to put any comments down below to help make these videos better as I'm trying to improve my content creation skills. Let's talk about how to get around the bosses going immune whenever you lust. On testing, it was possible to mass dispel these off, but we don't know if that's going to make it to live. However, the bosses will gain forbearance after casting certain abilities, which makes them unable to use their bubble or avenging wrath. So lusting at key moments in the fight will avoid the immunities. As you can see on the screen for Mythic, this means you can lust between 2 minutes and 30 seconds and 4 minutes and 55 seconds with no issue. And specifically, if you cast lust between 224 and 228, Bellamy and Sen will not be able to bubble, but Lightblood will still be able to use Avenging Wrath. This might be good because this also gives the 20% damage amp on Lightblood. However, this timing may not be great for people's CDs, so just keep that in mind when planning your strategy. When each boss casts their buff at 100 energy, they will plant and also do their main ability, so they will be immovable during this time. A good strategy for moving the bosses will be required to ensure you aren't losing significant uptime by either having the bosses inside the buff circle or by separating all the bosses too soon. I'll cover this positioning more in the tank section. You should make sure to get the bosses outside of Bellamy or Sen's buff circles, as all bosses in the circle will take 75% reduced damage or pacify you when you hit them. Lightblood's buff circle simply increases damage done by the bosses by 100%, so it's not technically necessary to get the bosses out of this. However, leaving them in it for any significant amount of time may end up in abilities one-shotting you, so it's still best to separate them quickly. I didn't see it tested, but be on the lookout for potential immune soaking of Execution Sentence. This may lead to some clever positioning where you overlap circles and have fewer people in each, but multiple immune players in the overlap to provide more total players in each circle. For example, you could do a 3+1 strategy where you have 3 soaks overlapping in a Venn diagram and then 1 not. You could put 3 players with defensives in each of the grouped circles, then 3 immune players in the overlap, giving each circle 6 players. Then you could stack 8 players in the solo soak. Strategies like this might pop up to help reduce total damage taken or keep key players alive, but you should also weigh the difficulty of implementing this strategy in real time, as it might prove quite challenging to coordinate mid-encounter. You're going to want to assign soaks for Execution Sentence before going into the fight. And importantly, on Mythic, it appeared that 4 healers would always be the targets of the Execution Sentence, so you can potentially prepare specific locations for each healer and their expected soakers. This would work similar to Queen Ansarek P1 bombs, where you may have to move these soak locations throughout the phase. It's also important to note that there is nothing stated in the dungeon journal about requiring a specific number of people in each soak, so it's possible that Holy Paladin might have an important role here because they can simply bubble immune their soak, greatly reducing the total damage the raid takes and simplifying the strategy. Finally, we get to the heal absorbs from Tyr's Wrath. These heal absorbs are approximately 2 times a player's total health pool, and Sen will put it out on the closest players to her every 3 seconds for 20 seconds. This may be one of the most difficult mechanics to strategize around, as it's also happening while other movement required mechanics are overlapping. I don't know if it's possible to immune it, but if so, this may be a better mechanic to immune than the Execution Sentence. Rogue's Cloak or Paladin's Bubble soaking 2 or more heal absorbs may prove extremely valuable. If immunes aren't an option, you will need to decide between having a few players soak a majority of the absorbs or spreading the absorbs out amongst the entire raid. Either way proves very dangerous. 5 people getting a 12 times health pool absorb may prove impossible to heal off before death. Meanwhile, 15 people getting a 4 times health absorb may still be too much to keep everyone alive. I don't have a clue as to optimal strategy here, so we're going to have to wait to see what the Race to World First guilds do and adjust that to fit your team, but just know you're likely popping some strong healer throughput CDs here. This fight does a large amount of damage both in spikes and consistent AoE, so having a good plan for healing CDs is going to be a must, and effective use of externals will be extremely helpful to keep targeted players alive. Lightblood's Sacred Toll simply does large raid-wide damage, but any overlap of this ability with others is a potential 2-shot. Specifically on testing, the time period shown here between 1 minute 10 seconds and 1 minute 18 seconds was particularly dangerous on Mythic. Sen is channeling Searing Radiance, which does ramping AoE damage for 15 seconds, and this period is towards the end of the channel. At 112, Bellamy hits the entire raid with an empowered Avenger's Shield, and finally at 116, Lightblood casts Sacred Toll. This combination of overlaps will hit for 80% to 150% of a person's HP to everyone in the raid at the same time. This is a near required spot for personal defensives, as it's unlikely that just healing CDs will consistently keep everyone alive. This is just one example, and this fight is rife with other overlaps. I'm not going to try and cover them all, but you should really focus on the timings listed in the spreadsheet and have a plan for either healing CDs or personal defensives on every potential overlap of the abilities you see on screen. Of course, since these timings were just from testing, they are likely to change come live, so make sure you're paying attention to any guilds who pull the boss before you to get any insights in how to change your healing plan. On top of all of these overlaps, Bellamy will be doing constant ticking AoE damage every 2 seconds that increases by 25% each time a boss casts their 100 energy buff circle, so this fight will become increasingly hard to heal near the end. For Tyr's Wrath heal absorbs, you're going to want to prepare strong throughput CDs. Based on current dungeon journal numbers, you will have to do approximately 1 million HPS for 20 seconds to immediately remove all absorbs, and that doesn't include healing any damage players take in that time period. This could be a great place to coordinate health pots or health stones on the whole raid. Remember that in early progression, people will be less familiar with the fight and are likely to take more avoidable damage, so having at least one healer who is talented into strong single target spike healing will be valuable until players are more comfortable. Both Lightblood and Bellamy use Judgment and then immediately follow it with a strong holy damage hit. Judgment is a 3-second cast that will do moderate holy damage and put a debuff on the target that greatly increases the damage of the following hit. The idea is simply to taunt swap mid-cast to avoid the same tank taking both the Judgment and follow-up hit from the same boss. This did have one caveat on testing, however. Prot Warrior could spell reflect Final Verdict, which is Lightblood's follow-up hit. Therefore, you could tank Lightblood, taunt Bellamy off the other tank during her Judgment cast, take the Shield of the Righteous follow-up from Bellamy, take the Judgment from Lightblood, and then spell reflect the Final Verdict to take no damage. Both follow-up hits from both bosses deal the same amount of holy damage, so I would assume that you can spell reflect both and you just choose which one works best for your strategy, but I can't confirm that as I'm not a tank. And of course, since this was on testing, we don't actually know if spell reflect will work on live. Sen's tank hit is Exorcism, which simply does moderate holy damage with no other effect. Just like many other fights in this raid tier, tanks will have their hands full with properly positioning the bosses. As I said in the strategy section, it's going to be very important to have a strong movement plan to avoid unnecessary time with bosses spent apart or standing in buff circles, as well as managing the placement of consecrations to allow enough room to finish the fight. I've thought of 2 potential methods to handle this. You can kite all bosses around the edge of the room, and when a boss is about to cast their buff, you keep them in place and move the other 2 bosses away. This was the strategy most people did on testing, and it has a couple of challenges. Moving the other 2 bosses may not always work due to them casting abilities, and trying to move the bosses and raid while also handling other mechanics like soaks, spread circles, and dodges will be very hectic. For that reason, I'm currently suggesting the next strategy as the one to try until we see something better. Instead of moving around the edge, you can tank all the bosses in the middle of the room and taunt the boss who is about to reach 100 energy out and away from the raid. This makes handling all the other mechanics of the fight simpler since the raid isn't constantly moving and trying to reposition. However, it does add significant challenge into the timing of the taunt. If you taunt the boss out to the edge too late, its buff circle and consecration afterwards may be in a very bad spot, greatly reducing the free space you have. Even with this difficulty, I think this is a better positioning strategy than moving the raid around the room.